Chapter 4, Listening Effectively. In this chapter, we're going to talk about listening. We'll talk about the difference between listening and hearing and some of the obstacles that we encounter when we are listening. Adler says how utterly amazing is the general assumption that the ability to listen well is a natural gift for which no training is required. And I think many of us will kind of be able to listen to this chapter and sit back and realize that we have some obstacles when it comes to our ability to listen effectively. In this assignment for this chapter, you'll also take a listening self-assessment just to kind of get a better idea of some of the struggles that we may have when it comes to listening. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this chapter. So hearing versus listening. So think of hearing as a physiological response to sound. That's something that happens automatically. It's unintentional. You hear something and you automatically that takes it in. Now, it doesn't mean that you process the sound, and it doesn't mean that you try to consider what the sound is, whereas listening requires you to pay a conscious attention. So you hear, you physically take in the sound. Listening is paying attention and consciously focusing on the sound. So the example that I can think of is that sometimes at night I'll wake up to a sound of some sort. And there'll be times when I think, not sure what that is. I'm pretty sure it's okay. And I go right back to sleep. And there's other times when I hear something that I think I probably need to get up and check that out and figure out what that sound was. And so sometimes we hear things and we're like, I think that's fine. It's no big deal. I don't need to pay attention to it. And other times when we hear a sound, we focus on it, we attend to it, we try to process what that sound is. So there's different types of listening. There's appreciative listening, which is listening for enjoyment or pleasure. So that's like when you're listening to music, if you're listening to poetry, anything like that is appreciative listening. And some of us may admit that we are much better at this level of listening. If you're like me, you'll hear a song maybe once or twice, and you have most of the words down, or at least you have the lyrics you think they are down, and it doesn't take very much time for you to really take in a song and process it and listen to it and really know it. Whereas there's other parts of our life where it's a challenge and an obstacle to listen. Relational listening is when we are listening to a friend or family member. That's helped building that relationship with one another through offering support and showing empathy for the situation they are discussing. So relational listening is basically the level of listening that it takes to build our relationships, to maintain and to build our relationships. So consider that with relational listening. We're going to talk about empathic here next, and they're similar but also different, because when you're in relational listening, you also show empathy and you put yourself in the person's shoes, but it's not in a professional level, whereas empathic and therapeutic listening is the type of listening that therapists or counselors or conflict mediators are trained in another level of relational listening. And so I used to be a school counselor, and I finished a master's program in counseling, and so that's a different type of listening. That's a trained type of listening when you're talking to someone's talking to you, you're listening carefully, you're picking up on things that they're saying. It's a different level of relational listening than maybe the empathic listening that we do in relationships. Critical listening is when we're at a political event or attending a debate, listening to a sales pitch. So that's the level of listening when you're hearing the message from the speaker and you're also thinking about it and evaluating it critically. So it's not just what is the speaker saying? It's, do I believe what the speaker is saying? Do I agree with what the speaker is saying? And it's taking it a little bit deeper. Informational listening is when we're gaining information. It's whether it's from a teacher in a classroom setting or a pastor at church. So that's a setting where we're listening to get the information. We're not necessarily analyzing it or critically debating it in our head or deciphering whether we believe it's right or wrong, but that's when we're just getting the information. So the values of listening. In listening, we can catch instructions, points, feedbacks, hints. We understand and make connections between ideas and information. When we're listening, it can kind of help us change our perspective and our assumptions, challenge our assumptions about things. Empathize and show respect or appreciation that enhances relationships and builds self-esteem. I think a lot of us have probably been in a relationship of some sort, whether it be a romantic relationship or a friendship, where we did not feel like we were heard adequately, where we did not feel like the other person in listening to us was empathizing with us. And sometimes I think I can have issues with this. If you're like me and you're a problem solver and someone shares a situation they're going through, and sometimes people just want to tell you what's going on with them, and they just need a kind ear, and they need someone to understand that they're struggling. But I sometimes have a habit of trying to fix that problem. So instead of just listening and saying, I'm so sorry that you're dealing with this, I really hate that this is going on in your life, then I sometimes try to say, okay, what can we do to fix this? Well, how can we approach this next time? And there's a appropriate time for both of those things, but I think sometimes we need to understand that sometimes when people are talking to us, they just need a kind ear. They need us to empathize and be respectful of their situation, and they may not need us to fix the problem. And we need to consider kind of how that impacts our relationships with others. Listening helps us stay in the communication loop. So I've definitely done this where I've been in a meeting or a group situation and a lot of people are talking and I find myself zoning out. And so at that point I realize I really can't hop in anywhere because I've let myself zone out a little bit. I have no idea what any of these conversations are about. And so I've taken myself out of the communication loop. So when you stay an active listener and you stay involved in the interactions, then you remain in the communication loop. It also helps us to be able to provide constructive feedback. Sometimes I think when we listen, we aren't really paying attention, we aren't focusing. And so when someone says, what were your thoughts? How did I do? Then you're like, oh yeah, you did great. Or I thought it went really well. And you're not really able to provide any constructive feedback of any type because you didn't listen intently and you don't really know what happened in the interaction. So there's a lot of values that can help us in all aspects of our life. I will say with every one of these, honing our listening skills is going to help us in our professional lives, with our superiors, with our coworkers, with people that may work below us in the hierarchy of our organization. But it's also going to help us in our personal lives, with our friendships, our romantic relationships, our family members, where people know that we are active, involved listeners in communication interactions. So there's 3 A's of active listening. The first is attention. Paying attention requires intentional effort. Consider creating a listening reminder. Prepare yourself for active attention. So pay attention and focus. Approach the task with a positive attitude and an open mind. Advance. Be flexible and willing to follow the speaker along what seems like a verbal detour down a rabbit hole until the speaker, reaching his or her final destination, rewards us. We don't know in advance what the speaker will say. Caponia warns against psychological deaf spots, which impair our ability to perceive and understand things counter to our convictions. So just be aware of, you want to know in advance that you're going to follow the speaker down the route that they take. If there's things that come up that you don't agree with, you're going to stay with them. You're going to listen and you'll analyze those things later, but you won't allow the message to be shut down because you don't want to hear what they have to say. So you have to pay attention. You have to approach the task with a positive attitude and an open mind, and you have to be advanced. You have to follow and advance through the message with the speaker. Barriers to effective listening: anticipating or thinking about what the speaker is likely to say. So sometimes we are thinking about what's going to come next. We are anticipating or thinking about what we want to say when the speaker is quiet. And so we're constantly kind of ahead of the speaker, and we're we're not focused on what the speaker is saying. Judging and jumping to conclusions about the speaker, reacting emotionally when the speaker says an emotional trigger can also lead to ineffective listening. I think for me sometimes, especially in meetings or small group situations, the biggest barrier is something is said that makes you think of something you need to contribute or you feel like you need to say. And so instead of listening to the rest of the message, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say when they stop and how I'm going to say that. And I think that anticipation is sometimes my biggest obstacle. And I think we do that in professional and personal situations too. So strategies to enhance listening. Keep an open mind that is focused and alert. Identify the things that will interrupt your attention. Come prepared when you can, and take notes. So it's always important to do attention checks. When's the last time I heard what the speaker said? When's the last time I took in the message? And these things will help you with becoming a more effective listener in your professional lives, your personal lives, but also as a student. Providing feedback to speakers. Nonverbal communication and feedback demonstrates openness to the speaker. It lets them know that you're there with them, that you're listening, you're nodding, you're smiling. And verbal feedback lets the speaker know that you've received their message, that you've understood their message, and that the information was clear. So encouraging effective listening. Write for the ear when you're writing. Write for the ear rather than for reading. Tap into intrinsic motivation. Remember like we've talked about previously, when you're speaking, you only have one opportunity to convey your message effectively. Versus writing, you can be wordy, you can be complicated, you can be all these fancy language, and your readers can read and reread. But when you're writing for the ear, you want it simple. So make sure that you are keeping things simple for your audience. Tap into intrinsic motivation. What's going to motivate my audience to listen to me? Cue your listeners by employing an active voice. So when you talk about your listeners, involve them with the way that you're communicating the message. Convince listeners to engage by responding. So sometimes it may be okay to convince listeners to engage by responding to people or talk to them in their speech about an action that you'd like to take in the end. I hope this helps you with listening. It's a skill that some of us struggle with, and some of us have to be a lot more cognizant of maybe some of our issues with listening, but to be able to become a more effective listener, be aware of our challenges, that can only help us in all aspects of our lives.